What's up, everybody? Welcome to Photography According to Me. This kind of video series is really a catch-up for the people who didn't make it to our in-person classes and didn't get that hands-on experience, which, if you're like, oh, well, I'll just watch all the videos, you really shouldn't. You owe it to yourself to get out there and ask questions and get that hands-on approach. We're going to be doing some practicing with models, things like that in the future. So this video, this is number one video about exposure and how your camera works and stuff. But before we get into that, two things. I'm going to explain a little bit about myself. My name is Lee Engebretson. I'm a wedding photographer in Gig Harbor, Washington. I travel all over the country taking photos. It's a great profession. I love it. I'm all about photography, obviously. The second thing that we're going to talk about, or that I wanted to say before we got this class started, is that this course is called Photography According to Me. Now that seems kind of self-explanatory. This class is not the only way, these things that I'm teaching, these are not the only way to look at photography. It's how I look at photography. There are too many ways, too many techniques, too many different styles. There's just too much for one person to explain it all. But basically, we're going to be talking about how I understand photography, how I use light, how I use the camera and the settings and the modes and things like that. So let's dive right in. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to be talking about is exposure. Now you're probably going, well, can we talk about how my camera works? No, because you have to understand exposure before you understand what any of the modes do on your camera. There are three main points of exposure. Okay, you have your you've got your f-stop or aperture, you have your ISO, and you have your shutter speed. These three things kind of make a little pyramid. Is you got your aperture up here, and you got your ISO and your shutter speed. And those things work with your aperture to get the correct exposure for the shot that you're getting. But we're gonna start with easiest to most complicated, which would be ISO, shutter speed, aperture. Let's start with ISO. ISO is essentially fake light. And basically what it does is that it sees your image and it throws a bunch of pixels out there, random colors and shades and stuff like that to kind of brighten the image, or give kind of a look of brightening it. If you're thinking, oh, well, that's great, my camera does 25,000 ISO and I can just keep that up there and I can have the fastest shutter speed in the world. Don't do that. Seriously, don't do that. If you have a really high ISO and your camera is not built to really, cameras are not built equal, especially when it comes to ISO. Some cameras do like a bajillion ISO. Some cameras do like 5. When you have a higher ISO, and let's say you've maxed out your ISO, you're gonna have what we call noise. And noise is basically those aberrant pixels to an extent that your camera doesn't know what the hell's going on. It's like, I can't see anything, I don't understand this scene at all, so I'm just gonna shoot a bunch of like random pixels out there and hopefully it works. It almost never works. So it's what we call noise. This is kind of aberrant pixels. You get your magentas and your greens and stuff. Sometimes you get these stripes across your frame. It's really ugly. So don't be cranking your ISO way up there just to compensate because you want a fast shutter speed. Sometimes if it's a dark place and you're like, well, there's not enough light, my aperture is way down and my ISO is way up and my shutter speed is still too slow, you probably need to invest in a flash or something like that. But we'll get into that a little later. Anyway, so the next one we're going to talk about is shutter speed. Now, shutter speed is pretty important, and shutter speed, having a slow or a fast shutter speed can change the look of your image. So all these kind of the points of exposure can change the look of your image, but shutter speed and aperture is probably, those are the number one things that can change the look of your image. Shutter speed, pretty straightforward. Your shutter is open for so long and exposing your sensor to light, and then it closes, and that's basically it. That is shutter speed. When you have a super fast shutter speed, It's just open like that and it's closed. Super bright light, that's pretty helpful. When it's dark, your shutter speed needs to be open for longer because more light needs to get into your sensor. So having a shutter speed open for longer is obviously what needs to happen in some cases. You might be saying, well, why, in what situations would I ever want blur? Well, there's a couple. One, if you're doing like star trails, like I said, you're gonna want your shutter speed wide open to get all those stars. Two, if you're doing things like nature photography, where you've got a river coming through and you want a real smooth look to that water, that's another time that you're gonna want it. There's a million ways to use slow shutter speed. I use slow shutter speeds when I do cityscapes and stuff, because when I've got a little bit of water in front of the city, it's a really cool blur and reflection trade-off with the city and the city lights. There's a ton of different things you can do with slow shutter speed. Now, if you're shooting portraits, slow shutter speed, probably not what you want. I don't use it, and this is my class, so I'm not going to talk about how you can use it because I don't know how you would use it. Anyway, so now we've got shutter speed basically handled. The shutter's open. You're controlling how long the shutter is open for. Now, the big papa, aperture. Aperture is, in my opinion, by far the most important thing. I have strong feelings with aperture because it controls not only just like the exposure of your image, but also the mood or the attitude, the entire look of your image. If you have a low aperture, it will drastically change how your image looks. First, we're going to talk about how it works, because that's kind of a key part of aperture and how it relates to like exposure in general. Inside your lens, inside every lens, you have a little iris, and it shrinks and expands. Pretty simple. And the aperture number is like, that's like how wide open or closed that iris is. The easiest way to understand it is to look at the aperture and it's closing. You can look at it while you're taking a photo. Basically, that shutter, that little iris constricts or expands, and the more it constricts, the less light gets in. The iris is closing, so only a pinprick of light is getting to your sensor. Now, when you have a low aperture, that's super wide open, which means maybe the entire iris is pulled out to the farthest it can go, and that lets in the most light. Now, the trade-off here is that with a low aperture, one, more light gets in, so that's always good. More light's usually better. Having a wide open aperture, that's great. Here's the negative and the trade-off to it. If you have a lens, let's say a 51.2, and you're all the way open at 1.2, a tiny sliver of your image is going to be in focus. They call it depth of field. And that's essentially how shallow or wide your depth of field is. If you have a wide open aperture, your depth of field is extremely shallow, which means you could take a photo, my nose would be in focus, my eyes would not. That's how it works. So if you are like, oh, I really want that bokeh look, that super dramatic blur, and I kind of want the background to be very blurry, yeah, low aperture all the way. If you're in a situation where, like I am a lot with portraits, and even though I like to keep my aperture pretty low to get that artistic look, if I'm not dead on with the eyes, it's toast. Keep that in mind when choosing your aperture. Now, when it's nice and closed, when your aperture, let's say you've got it set to 22, that means basically the entire frame is going to be it's not technically going to be in focus, but it's going to be crisp. It's going to have more detail to the image. When you have that kind of bokeh, that blur to your image, it will drastically change the attitude, the kind of mood that you're giving off with your shot. So definitely keep that in mind. That's why I usually set my aperture first thing, and then my shutter speed, then my ISO to compensate. I imagine this like I said, as a pyramid, but also like kind of a teeter-totter. Like if you could have a three-way teeter-totter, this is how I imagine it. You have your shutter speed super fast, right? Your ISO super low, and your aperture super high. You're gonna get an incredibly underexposed photo most likely. Like, unless you're shooting on the sun or something. The reason I call it teeter-totter is they all have to be in balance. Let's say you want that bokeh look, so your aperture is wide open. To compensate for that, you're gonna have to have a higher shutter speed, and then you're gonna want a lower ISO. And the reason I say it that way is that I picked the ISO last, because if you want a slow shutter speed and a wide open aperture, you're gonna want to crank that thing way down. If you have a closed aperture and a high shutter speed, you're going to want it cranked up, because that's the only way to balance the 3 points. The only real way to learn it is to practice it, and we're going to get into how you practice that in a minute. But first, we're going to talk about modes. So modes. I have some strong opinions about modes and the different modes that the cameras offer. So being Canon, we're going to talk about the Canon modes. The Nikon modes, even though they're called a different thing, do the same thing. So the first one, and probably the one I have the strongest opinions about, is auto mode. And I think that most professional photographers probably hate auto mode. I'm not going to say all, because I don't know all the professional photographers out there. Somebody out there could be using auto mode and their photos are just pristine and beautiful, and they're like, your photos look terrible, you should use auto mode. But I haven't met them yet, so we're going to go off of my understanding and my expertise on this. Auto mode, probably the worst. Now, if you're running around the house and you're just trying to get photos of your kids or something, and you don't have time to understand the sciences behind how your camera works, auto mode all the way. But auto mode is also, you might as well just be shooting with an iPhone. I mean, auto mode chooses everything. Auto mode tells you exactly your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO, and it just basically it accepts all the light and it says, okay, here's what we're gonna do. I don't like that. I like to have total control. I have authority issues, you might say. So when my camera, an inanimate object, is telling me what's best, auto mode. It's like shooting in JPEG. I don't like it. I've expressed my many opinions, well, at least a few of them, about auto mode. Let's talk about P mode. Now P mode, a lot of people think means portrait mode. It doesn't. P mode on your camera means program mode. Now program mode is basically auto mode, with the caveat that you can kind of give the camera some suggestions, like, oh, I want a lower aperture, so you move your wheel to pull that down. It's like a less pushy boss, but it's still your boss. So if you're gonna use a mode and still want to have a little control, P mode's the way to go. Again, I hate being told what to do in any sense, and that applies to all of these modes -2. So anyway, moving on from P mode, let's talk about TV mode. Now TV, I don't remember exactly what it stands for, but I think it's time variable. That's how I think of it, meaning that it prioritizes what shutter speed you pick. Basically, you tell it, hey, I want the shutter speed of 200. It changes the other 2 settings for you to even it out for perfect exposure. It's awesome. I used TV mode when I first learned how to use a camera. Until I really kind of got a grasp on what my camera was doing, TV mode was basically all I used. Now, the same AV mode, it's the same thing, but aperture prioritized. Aperture variable, meaning I want a 1.2. I want a 1.4 aperture. It changes the other ones for you. That's super handy. I don't personally use it, again, but yeah, as far as a starting tool, AV mode's great. Manual mode. Manual mode is exactly what it sounds like. It's manual mode, meaning you control everything. Almost every professional photographer I know uses manual mode, specifically because You know what? I don't know. But I use it specifically because I have total control over my image. Now, it does take some practice. You're gonna take a million bad photos, but that's okay because we're shooting digital. It doesn't cost you anything. So take a bajillion bad photos. So you're gonna take some bad photos trying manual mode, but keep at it because having control over your image and exactly how you want it to look, in my opinion, is priceless. I think that I couldn't say enough good things about manual mode. The B mode stands for bulb, and bulb is super useful for long exposures. B mode, basically what it does is it means that for however long you hold down your shutter, so if you go pop, it's gonna do whatever, forever how long it times it, and when you press it down, it releases. When you close it closes back up. This is particularly useful for when you're shooting stars and other things like that, early morning, mostly nature, I would have to guess. Bulb mode basically gives you the ability to shoot past 30 seconds. So if you needed 33 seconds, in manual mode, you'd be screwed. In bulb mode, you can hold that down for 33 seconds. Now you still have complete control over your ISO and your aperture, which is why bulb mode is like super useful, especially for star photos. The other ones that you might have, depending on the type of camera you've got C1, C2, C3. Those are just custom ones. I've never used them. I don't know much about them. That's all I gotta say about modes. So that pretty much concludes today's class about exposure. If you have any other questions about it, private message me, email me. I'll put some contact information in the link below. So anyway, get out there and practice, and hopefully we'll see you at the next class, which I believe is on June 9th, 2018. That is a Saturday. We're going to be doing some portrait photography and kind of learning how light affects portrait photography, composition, things like that. So hopefully I see you there, and I'll have more information for you when I have the information for myself.